Hey guys, tonight we are trading neon cities and modern ghosts for the slow breath of history, the kind that smells of dust, cardamom and candle smoke. We are in Istanbul, though it was not called that yet. Tonight's story begins when the Crescent still ruled over half the known world, when ships from 3 continents bowed to a single harbour, and when one small, seemingly logical decision began the slow unthreading of 1,000 years of empire. You probably would not survive a week here, not because of war or plague, but because of politics, which can be far more dangerous than disease. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are awake somewhere far from the Bosphorus, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing the constellation of night owls scattered across the map. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The candle burns low beside you and the wax pools like melted gold. Outside, the city hums, the echo of muezzins, the slap of waves against old stone, the shuffle of horses on cobblestones slick with salt and rain. You walk through narrow streets that twist like memory, through markets where merchants are still awake, their voices rasping with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from centuries of repetition. The smell of roasted chickpeas mingles with the metallic tang of the harbour. Somewhere nearby, a call to prayer overlaps with the sound of a violin. Empires never fall all at once. They dissolve slowly, like sugar in bitter coffee. You reach the courtyard of Topkapi Palace, its marble cool beneath the moonlight. Once this was the centre of everything, the empire's beating heart. Every whisper of intrigue, every order of war, every tender decree of love or exile passed through these gates. But tonight, it feels more like a mausoleum than a palace. You can almost hear the ghosts of scribes scratching their quills, of eunuchs pacing behind silk curtains, of sultans wondering if God still listens to the prayers of men who wear crowns. The candlelight flickers against the tiles, reflecting in thousands of tiny blue eyes, painted into the ceramics, each one a silent witness to centuries of glory and paranoia. The year is 1856, give or take. The Ottoman Empire has just survived another war, barely. The Crimean conflict has drained the treasury, and the Europeans, with their polite smiles and clever contracts, have begun to circle like gulls above a dying whale. In an attempt to seem modern, the Sultan's advisors urge him to borrow, to westernize, to align the empire's pulse with the ticking clocks of Paris and London. It seems reasonable. Everyone else is doing it. But reason in history is often just the polite mask of disaster. The decision to open the empire's veins to European finance, secured loans for railways, arms and reform, will prove to be the slowest kind of suicide. You walk through the palace corridors where oil lamps cast trembling halos on the walls. The air smells faintly of cedar and ink. In one chamber, a clerk with sleepless eyes is drafting the latest imperial decree. His fingers are stained black, his handwriting elegant but weary. He believes he is saving his nation, inviting modernity, importing progress like a new perfume. Yet every coin borrowed abroad is another thread cut from sovereignty, another promise made to creditors who will one day arrive, not with ships, but with ledgers. He does not know it, but he is writing the empire's epitaph in perfect Ottoman script. Outside the window, the Bosphorus gleams like a blade under the moon. Ships drift by, their masts rising like skeletal fingers. Somewhere on one of them, a British diplomat in a tailored coat clinks glasses with a French investor. They toast to civilization, progress and profit. 3 words that have toppled more nations than any army. Their laughter echoes faintly across the water, reaching the palace walls though no one inside hears it. Or perhaps they do, but they pretend not to. Pretending not to hear has always been one of humanity's oldest survival skills. You move deeper into the night. The palace garden stretches out before you, rows of cypress trees like sentinels, fountains murmuring in forgotten languages, You remember reading somewhere that each fountain here once whispered poetry, verses carved in marble by artisans who believed water could remember sound. Now the fountains murmur only of absence. You sit beside one and watch the reflection of the crescent moon shatter in its basin as a breeze passes through. Somewhere behind you, the Sultan is awake. He sits in a private room lined with books he cannot read without translators, letters from ambassadors written in languages that call him Your Majesty, but think your problem. He was not born cruel, this Sultan. He was born into a world that told him he was chosen by God to govern millions, and then handed him a realm already unraveling. He speaks often of reform. He imagines himself enlightened. Yet every reform breeds resistance. Every promise of progress sows new divisions. His scholars argue about secularization. His generals whisper about betrayal. And his people, well, his people simply survive, as they always have, through faith, fatigue, and gossip. Somewhere in the harem, the women still laugh softly. Somewhere in the barracks, the soldiers still sharpen their blades. The fatal mistake has not yet fully happened. Though the fuse burns quietly, it is not one decision but a mood, a way of thinking, the belief that borrowing Western strength could preserve Eastern dignity. The empire's ministers speak of railways and telegraphs, of schools and factories, of an Ottoman renaissance, but beneath their optimism lies the same arrogance that once convinced Rome it could buy loyalty and build eternity from credit. The empire begins to wear a costume stitched from European fabric, beautiful but ill-fitting. The music in the palace changes, violins replacing ouds, French replacing Persian, etiquette replacing instinct. No one notices that the empire's heart has begun to beat to a foreign rhythm. As dawn approaches, you wander toward the outer courtyards, where servants scrub the stones clean of candle wax and fallen petals. The city below is waking, bakers lighting fires, fishermen untying their boats. The smell of bread mixes with salt air. For a moment it feels eternal again. But you notice the cracks, small hairline fractures in the marble steps, the kind that will one day split open into history lessons. You think of how every civilization decays, not from invasion but from exhaustion, from the weight of its own contradictions. You think of the Sultan's candle, still burning somewhere inside, a small flame fighting the dawn. A faint breeze carries the first light over the domes and minarets. The call to prayer rises, echoing across the strait. It sounds beautiful, fragile and infinite all at once. You close your eyes and listen, knowing that even beauty can be fatal when it convinces those who hear it that it will last forever. The voice fades, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of hooves and carriage wheels. A new day has begun, and with it, another meeting, another decree, another small choice that will seem harmless until it is not. If you listen carefully, beneath the murmur of the sea and the chatter of markets, you can already hear the sound of debt collectors crossing the continent, the quiet footsteps of empire unmade not by war, but by interest rates and signatures. It will take decades before the final collapse, but the candle has already begun to drown in its own wax. You turn back one last time toward the palace. The rising sun paints it gold again, erasing the night's melancholy. From afar it looks whole, powerful, eternal, but you know better now. You know that empires do not die when they are conquered. They die when they forget how to imagine themselves free. The candle burns lower now, its light softening the carved walls of Topkapi like memory smoothing over grief. You are still walking the corridors, though the night has aged around you. The palace has changed faces with the passing hours. The servants have vanished, replaced by courtiers in embroidered robes who glide through the air like ghosts rehearsing old ceremonies. Somewhere deep inside, behind layers of velvet and gold, the Sultan stands before a mirror taller than a man, framed in mother of pearl and ivory. The reflection he sees is not himself but an empire wearing his face, weary and beautiful and utterly uncertain of its own survival. He adjusts his robe, straightens his turban, and stares into the glass. The eyes looking back are both his and not his. They belong to centuries of rulers before him, to conquerors who once commanded oceans and deserts, who spoke and entire cities obeyed. But he is not a conqueror. He is a caretaker of decline. His name will not be remembered for victory but for reform, and that thought troubles him more than he admits. You can almost hear his breathing, steady, practiced but shallow, a man taught since childhood that even doubt must be performed with grace. Behind him, an aide waits silently with a stack of papers, reports, petitions, translations of foreign letters sealed with crests from Paris, London, Vienna. The Sultan gestures for him to place them on the table. He will read them later, or perhaps he will not. Reading is an act of confrontation, and tonight he prefers reflection. The candlelight trembles, and for a moment he imagines the mirror whispering. Mirrors have always had that power over lonely men. You step closer. The marble beneath your feet is cold enough to bite through the soles of your shoes. Every surface here seems to remember. Footsteps, viziers, generals, concubines, scribes, all of them now gone, leaving only a residue of perfume and fear. Somewhere beyond the walls, a cannon fires from the strait, a signal of arrival. Foreign envoys, most likely. They come bearing gifts and debts disguised as friendship, their ships fat with coal and confidence. The Sultan straightens his posture. He is tired of feeling like the last page of a great book. One of his attendants enters, bowing deeply, informing him that the ambassadors from France and Britain have arrived. They bring with them new proposals, new loans, new words like restructuring and guarantee. He listens without blinking, though his mind drifts elsewhere to his childhood, to the lessons of his tutors who spoke of divine right and eternal order. No one had mentioned interest rates. No one had explained that faith can be collateral. He thanks the attendant, dismisses him, and turns once more to the mirror. The reflection seems older now. The candlelight exaggerates the wrinkles beneath his eyes. He whispers something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse, and steps away. Outside the hall, the air shifts. You follow him through the long colonnade, where each archway frames a piece of the night, domes, stars, the dark ribbon of the Bosphorus. He walks slowly, hands clasped behind his back like a man balancing invisible weights. The guard at the door salutes as he passes. The Sultan does not respond. He no longer knows whether loyalty is a comfort or a trap. In the council chamber, the ambassadors wait. Their uniforms gleam with polished buttons, their breath faintly scented with tobacco and triumph. They rise when he enters, bowing just enough to suggest respect but not enough to imply equality. The meeting begins with pleasantries. As always, weather, trade, civilization. You have heard these conversations before, though never from so close. It sounds like diplomacy, but underneath the velvet words runs a quiet current of ownership. The Europeans do not ask for permission. They ask for access, to build railways, to manage customs, to modernize ports. The Sultan nods, but each nod feels like the turning of a key in someone else's lock. He wonders whether they can smell his desperation beneath the perfume. He knows the empire's debts are mounting. He knows his own ministers whisper about reforms they barely understand. Western education, Western law, Western banking, all imported like exotic fruit that rots before it reaches the table. One of the ambassadors mentions that progress requires partnership. Partnership, of course, means dependence. Dependence disguised as grace. You can feel the temperature drop slightly as the Sultan signs another agreement. The ink shines wet on the paper, black as oil. History records moments like these with bureaucratic indifference, treaties, reforms, concessions, but standing here watching the wax seal harden, you can feel the air itself tighten. Empires rarely notice when they cross the line between sovereignty and performance. When the meeting ends, the Sultan remains seated long after the foreigners have gone. The courtiers hover uncertainly. One of them, a young advisor barely 30 years old, approaches and murmurs that the reforms will secure the empire's future. His voice trembles slightly, as if seeking forgiveness in advance. The Sultan nods without answering. He stares at the papers until the ink dries. Then at his own hands. They look unfamiliar, like the hands of a clerk rather than a ruler. Later, as the palace sleeps, he walks alone into the gardens. The moonlight glints off the fountains, and the night smells of jasmine and wet stone. He stops near the reflecting pool and studies his reflection again, distorted by ripples. For the first time, he feels something close to fear, not of rebellion or assassination, but of irrelevance. The world beyond the palace walls is changing faster than he can decree. Telegraph wires stretch like veins across continents. Trains devour distance. Steamships bring news faster than prayer can reach heaven. And here in the center of it all stands an empire built on rituals older than most of the machines now remaking the world. You remember that this same mirror once reflected Suleiman the Magnificent, the conqueror who expanded the empire's borders until they kissed 3 seas. You remember the poets who called Istanbul the city of the world's desire. Now the city itself feels uncertain of its own desire. Half of its people look westward, dreaming of Europe's factories and fashions. The other half cling to the call to prayer, terrified that progress might mean forgetting God. The Sultan, poor man, belongs to neither world fully. He returns to his chambers and finds a letter waiting for him. It is from a cousin living in exile, warning him that the empire's strength lies not in imitation but in belief. He reads it twice, then places it on the desk beside the treatise. 2 different futures lying side by side, one written in faith, the other in finance. He wonders which will outlast him. You follow him as he sits by the window overlooking the Bosphorus. The horizon glows faintly with the lights of foreign ships anchored in Ottoman waters, each one carrying engineers, soldiers, and accountants. The holy trinity of modern empire. The Sultan whispers a verse from the Quran under his breath, though he is not sure whether it comforts him. Behind him the candle finally gutters out, leaving the room in darkness except for the cold blue light of dawn. In the silence that follows, you hear the empire breathing, slowly, unevenly, like an old man trying to remember a song from his youth. Somewhere deep in the city, a printing press clatters. Somewhere else, a cannon rusts. And between them, a ruler wonders when exactly power became performance. You think of all the mirrors in history, how they flatter before they betray. Outside, the first rays of sunlight touch the domes and minarets. The city stirs again, unaware that the day has already been bought and sold by signatures written in another language. The Sultan closes his eyes. In his mind, he still rules a world of poets and warriors. But when he opens them again, he sees clerks, creditors, and ambassadors. The reflection has changed, and no amount of prayer can unmake the ink on those pages. The candle is gone now, the wax hardened into a small, twisted sculpture of its own exhaustion. The mirror stands silent. The empire, for the moment, still breathes. But somewhere deep beneath its ribs, the first cracks widen, too small for history to notice, but large enough for destiny to whisper through. The morning after the meeting feels like a hangover that belongs not to a man, but to an empire. The sunlight strikes the Bosphorus in wide golden bands, and the air carries the metallic scent of industry mixed with sea salt. Down by the docks, a new sound has joined the familiar rhythm of oars and gulls, the hiss of steam. British-built vessels groan as they load crates of coal and cannon parts, the imports of modernity. You walk among the workers, their hands black with soot, and their eyes wary of the uniformed inspectors who pass between them with clipboards and contempt. Istanbul has always been a port of arrivals, but lately the arrivals feel heavier, less like trade and more like annexation by ledger. You follow the smell of ink and coffee through the old quarter, where scribes once copied poems and legal decrees by hand. Now, in a dim upper room above a spice shop, the first printing press permitted by the empire clatters like a mechanical heart. Its owner, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, grins as the pages slide out, fresh, smudged, revolutionary. Progress, he murmurs, wiping his hands. But his apprentice, a boy no older than 16, asks quietly whether progress always smells this much like burning metal. The man laughs it off. You can see the boy's unease linger in the air like smoke. Down the street, bureaucrats hurry toward the Ministry of Finance, their boots echoing against marble steps that once felt eternal. Inside, the mood is electric and anxious. A new class of men has emerged, educated in Paris or Vienna, dressed in Western suits, speaking of efficiency and commerce. They are the empire's new priests, their faith written not in scripture but in columns of numbers. They speak the language of reform with missionary zeal, budget, investment, modernization. But beneath their polished shoes lies the old Ottoman dust, thick with forgotten debts and quiet prayers. They believe they are saving the empire by turning it into an imitation of Europe. You can almost forgive them. Imitation feels like flattery until it becomes surrender. As you climb the ministry's staircase, you catch fragments of conversation. A new railway will unite the provinces. A European loan can fund the telegraph lines. We must modernize our army, or be left behind. Every idea sounds noble. Every one requires borrowing. Outside, the imperial treasury's guards stand stiff in their uniforms, unaware that the empire they protect is being sold piece by piece in the form of signatures. You pause at a window overlooking the courtyard where clerks carry sacks of silver coins into waiting carriages. The horses stamp impatiently, steam rising from their nostrils. It looks almost ceremonial, this movement of wealth, outward tribute paid not to conquerors but to creditors. You walk out into the streets again, where the scent of roasted chestnuts drifts through the cold air. A group of students passes by, laughing, their faces alive with the arrogance of youth. They talk about Europe the way lovers talk about forbidden desire. One carries a French novel under his arm, the spine cracked from overuse. Another hums a tune that sounds suspiciously Parisian. They are not traitors, they are dreamers. They believe that freedom and progress are the same thing, and perhaps they are right. But the empire they live in is not built to dream in two languages. It can praise God in Arabic and issue decrees in Ottoman Turkish. But French is a mirror that flatters and deceives at the same time. The afternoon drifts toward the smell of rain. You cross Galata Bridge, where fishermen line the rails and gossip about rumors from the palace. They say the Sultan has begun collecting clocks, hundreds of them ticking and chiming, each one set to a different time zone. He likes to walk among them, they whisper, as if trying to find the hour where his empire still belongs. Some claim he never sleeps anymore, only watches the shadows move across the walls. You imagine that sound, hundreds of clocks, hundreds of tiny mechanical hearts beating out the empire's confusion. Across the water, in a smoky coffee house filled with merchants and poets, the conversation grows bold. A journalist, his fingers stained with nicotine and newsprint, reads aloud from an illegal pamphlet. It speaks of equality before the law, of freedom of the press, of representation. The listeners nod, murmuring prayers and curses in the same breath. The pamphlet is printed on cheap paper, the ink still tacky. It smells like rebellion. You realize this is how history shifts, not in palaces but in rooms like this, where words ignite before gunpowder ever does. Night falls quickly over Istanbul. The gas lamps flicker on one by one, their yellow glow reflecting in puddles. Somewhere far off, a cannon salutes the arrival of another European envoy. The sky over the city turns the color of bruised copper. You walk through narrow alleys where cats prowl and street vendors whisper prices. The empire at night is both magnificent and exhausted, like an aging actor still insisting on taking the stage. You pass an open doorway and catch sight of a scholar bent over a desk, his beard long, his pen steady. He is translating a French treatise on governance into Ottoman script. Every few lines he pauses and sighs, muttering that some ideas lose their soul when translated. You wonder if he means the words or himself. Later, in the dim courtyard of an old madrasa, a group of clerics argues by lamplight. Their robes rustle like restless wings. They fear that all this modernization is stripping the empire of its divine purpose. One of them quotes the prophet, "A nation that forgets its prayers forgets its future." Another replies that ignorance, not prayer, is the true enemy. Their debate dissolves into silence when they hear footsteps approaching. The palace guards, perhaps, or spies listening for sedition. The lamplight trembles, and you realize that even faith has learned to whisper. You find yourself once again by the Bosphorus. The ships anchored there gleam faintly under the moon. Flags from Britain, France, and Russia ripple in the cold wind. You recall that each flag once meant alliance, but tonight they look like ownership. Somewhere on the opposite shore, a gunshot cracks the stillness. An accident, perhaps, or an omen. The seagulls startle, their wings flashing white before they vanish into the dark. You pause at the edge of the water and watch the reflection of the city ripple and distort. The minarets appear to waver like candle flames. You think of the clerks and the students, the poets and the priests, all convinced they are saving something that may not want to be saved. Empires, after all, do not die of betrayal alone. They die when the people who love them the most begin to remake them in someone else's image. By dawn, the city quiets again. The first call to prayer drifts across the water. Steady and familiar, the fishermen yawn and reel in their lines. The coal barges belch black smoke. Somewhere in the palace, the Sultan wakes from a dream in which he is both ruler and prisoner. He rises, dresses, and faces. Yet another day of decisions dressed as miracles. You turn from the Bosphorus, feeling the chill settle into your bones. The candlelight of empire flickers on, but you can already smell the smoke. The sound of rain begins as a whisper against the tiled roofs, then deepens into a rhythm that matches the city's uneasy heartbeat. You are in a different part of the empire now, not Istanbul but Vienna, where diplomats sit beneath chandeliers that glitter like frozen lightning. Here, in the polished halls of Europe, men with mustaches and monocles play with empires the way children play with marbles. Maps are spread across mahogany tables, borders are discussed like fashion trends. You stand in the corner, unnoticed, watching the outlines of the Ottoman realm turn faintly translucent under the candlelight. They call it the Eastern Question, as if it were an algebra problem instead of a civilization. One of them, a tall, silver-haired statesman from Britain, leans forward and taps the map with his gloved finger. "We must maintain balance," he says, his voice smooth as cream poured over poison. A strong Ottoman presence keeps the bear in check. The bear, of course, means Russia, whose armies wait like hungry wolves beyond the Black Sea. Around the table, men nod, sipping wine, pretending to discuss justice while quietly calculating profit. To them, the Ottoman Empire is not a living thing but a chessboard. The Sultan is a king they can move, protect, or sacrifice as strategy demands. You can almost hear the faint scratching of their pens, the real weapons of their age. Outside, Vienna hums with music and money. The coffee houses are full of gossip. The newspapers carry caricatures of Turkish soldiers and sly jokes about decline. The irony is that the empire they mock still feeds their factories, still sends grain, cotton, and silk through the same ports they pretend to pity. Empires rarely die alone. They are eaten politely by their neighbors. You walk through the city's rain-slicked streets, where the lamps reflect on cobblestones like 1,000 small mirrors. Somewhere behind a shuttered window, a violin plays a waltz by Strauss, and for a moment you imagine the Ottoman ambassadors who once attended these same parties, their robes traded for tailcoats, their pride disguised as charm. They spoke in measured French, bowed just enough, laughed at jokes they barely understood, and went home wondering whether civilization was simply a more elegant form of surrender. The next morning, a letter leaves Vienna addressed to Istanbul, sealed with wax bearing the crest of the British Embassy. It promises partnership, stability, friendship, those soft-edged words that history always translates into dependency. A courier carries it by train to the coast, then by steamer across the Aegean. Weeks later, it reaches the palace, where an interpreter reads it aloud in careful Ottoman Turkish. The Sultan listens, nodding slowly. He has heard the same song before. He still wants to believe that this time it means harmony. You follow the courier back across Europe, through landscapes that look increasingly industrial, increasingly grey. The old world is dissolving into factories and railways. Everywhere, nations are rising on the fumes of nationalism, and the Ottoman Empire, once a mosaic of languages, faiths and loyalties, now seems old-fashioned in its tolerance. The very thing that made it vast now makes it vulnerable. The Christians of the Balkans look north toward Russia for protection. The Arabs of the desert look east toward Mecca for renewal, and the Europeans look at the map and see opportunity. By the time you return to Istanbul, the rain from Vienna has followed you in spirit. The city smells of wet stone and coal smoke. The Sultan's ministers gather again to debate the European question. Some urge closer ties, some urge caution, but all agree on one thing: the empire must appear modern. And so more money is borrowed, more foreign advisors are hired, and the palace grows quieter as decisions migrate into embassies. One evening you wander through the Galata district, where European merchants live in tall stone houses that overlook the sea. Their windows glow warm with light, and the sound of laughter spills into the fog. Down below, Turkish labourers load cargo, their backs bent, their wages meagre. The gap between ruler and ruled, between the empire's heart and its hands, has widened into something perilous. In one tavern, a sailor mutters that the Sultan's treasury is now guarded by foreigners. Another spits and says the empire no longer belongs to its people but to its creditors. You realize these are the first murmurs of rebellion, tiny, fragile, but alive. The following morning, a cold wind sweeps across the Bosphorus. Ships from Britain and France are docked in the harbour, their flags fluttering like polite threats. The ambassadors come ashore, greeted with fanfare, their boots clacking on Ottoman marble. They are escorted to the palace for a banquet. You walk beside them, unseen, listening to the rustle of silk and the metallic jingle of medals. The air smells of rosewater and politics. Inside, the dining hall gleams with candlelight. The table stretches endlessly. Heavy with porcelain and gold, the Sultan sits at its head, smiling with the weary precision of a man performing contentment. Toasts are made in several languages. Someone jokes about how the empire's kitchens have mastered French recipes. Everyone laughs, except the Sultan. He raises his glass anyway, murmuring something about friendship between nations. The ambassador beside him nods approvingly. Later, when the plates are cleared and the orchestra begins to play, you notice how the Sultan's hands tremble slightly under the table. It is not fear, it is fatigue, the kind that comes from pretending power is still absolute when it is already conditional. After the guests depart, the Sultan walks through the empty hall. The candles burn low, and the scent of wine and wax lingers. He pauses by a window overlooking the city. Beyond the palace walls, Istanbul still glows with life, lamps, fires, laughter. But to him it all feels distant. He touches the glass and whispers, "They think we are finished." His reflection stares back, neither confirming nor denying. The fatal mistake has deepened. It is no longer a single act of borrowing or trust, but a habit, a posture. The empire has become fluent in dependency. Its reforms have turned inward, eating at their own purpose. And in Europe, men toast to Ottoman progress while quietly drafting its obituary. You step outside into the night air. The wind off the sea is sharp, full of salt and inevitability. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbles. A storm crossing from the Balkans, perhaps, or something older, more patient, approaching from within. You pull your coat tighter and walk along the shore where the waves break like exhausted applause against the stones. The empire still stands. Yes, the crescent still rises above its minarets. But even the stars seem to blink slower now, as if history itself is holding its breath, waiting for the next signature, the next dinner, the next small, reasonable decision that will make the undoing complete. And in Vienna, in London, in St. Petersburg, The maps are still spread open under the same glittering chandeliers. The men around them smile. The Eastern question, they say, will soon answer itself. You wake to the sound of typewriters and thunder. The air in the city feels electric, restless, as if the clouds themselves have been waiting too long to release what they hold. Decades have passed since those early treaties, and the empire you walk through now is not the same one that once stretched across 3 continents. The palaces are still beautiful, yes, but the gold leaf has dulled, the fountains have cracked, and the whispers that once fluttered through marble corridors have hardened into arguments. The air tastes like revolution. You find yourself among students again, only now their laughter has sharpened into slogans. They meet in the cafes of Pera, huddled around cups of strong black coffee that could strip paint off the walls. Their faces glow with conviction. They call themselves the Young Turks, though some of them are not so young anymore. They believe that by reinventing the empire they can rescue it from the ruins of its own indecision. The air around them is thick with cigarette smoke and idealism, and their words strike like sparks. Liberty, equality, progress, each syllable a rebellion against the heavy perfume of the old court. They are inspired by Europe, but also disillusioned by it. They see how the same nations that preach freedom still carve up weaker lands like meat. They know that the Ottoman Empire has become Europe's patient, diagnosed, dissected and pitied, yet they refuse to accept its death. They talk of new constitutions, of parliament, of education for all citizens regardless of faith. It sounds radical, even dangerous, but in their eyes you glimpse the same fierce clarity that once drove sultans to conquer and poets to build worlds out of words. One night, you follow them to a hidden printing press. The machine grinds out pamphlets calling for reform, for unity, for an empire reborn through its own people rather than its palace. Each page smells of ink and defiance. You can hear the rain beating against the window, steady as the heartbeat of change. One of the students, his name lost to time, like so many others, leans close and says quietly, "We are not trying to destroy the empire. We are trying to wake it up." You believe him. You want to believe him. But you know how fragile awakenings can be. The next morning, soldiers patrol the streets. The government has caught wind of the movement. Arrests are made. Some students vanish into cells. Others flee across the sea to Cairo or Paris. Still, the ideas persist, moving faster than borders can contain them. You see them in the eyes of merchants, in the sermons of imams, in the songs of workers who hum beneath their breath. Liberty has become contagious, even among those who cannot afford it. In the palace, the Sultan feels the shift. He has ruled for more than 30 years. His reign as long as his shadows. He believes he has modernized the empire, built schools, telegraphs, railways, but he has also built prisons. He knows that power cannot coexist easily with freedom. Every whisper of dissent feels like treason. Every letter from abroad like a knife slipped beneath the door. You can almost pity him, surrounded by advisors who speak in cautious tones, afraid to tell him that the empire outside his window no longer belongs entirely to him. You watch him at dusk, standing on the balcony of Yildiz Palace, gazing over the city. Below him, the lights of Istanbul flicker like embers scattered across the hills. He remembers the empire as it was when he ascended the throne, vast, untamed, full of promise. Now he feels it slipping through his fingers, one province at a time. The Balkans, Egypt, the Arabian deserts, all restless, all half lost. He whispers a prayer, but it feels more like a confession. His fatal mistake is the same one all rulers make when they mistake silence for loyalty. In the barracks, soldiers murmur too. Some are loyal to the Sultan, others to the constitution that was promised and then revoked. They polish their rifles by candlelight, uncertain which direction they will one day fire them. In the mess halls, the air is thick with suspicion. Every conversation sounds like a conspiracy. You stand among them as they eat. Stew, bread, and anxiety. A captain recites a line from a French philosopher about freedom. A sergeant glares and mutters that philosophers do not win wars. Outside, thunder rolls again, and the lamps flicker. Then, almost suddenly, it happens. The young Turks rise. From the city of Salonika, the army marches toward the capital, demanding the restoration of the constitution. The Sultan hesitates, then yields, reinstating it to avoid bloodshed. Crowds fill the streets, waving flags, shouting, "Long live liberty!" You feel the air tremble with hope. For a brief moment it seems the empire has found its heartbeat again. But history, as always, is a trickster. Liberty births factions, factions breed ambition, and ambition soon forgets its ideals. Within months the dream fractures, religious conservatives against secular reformers, old generals against young officers, loyalty against logic. You watch as the same students who once whispered freedom now debate control. The empire has changed its costume again, but not its script. Years pass in a blur of reforms, revolts, and compromises. The streets of Istanbul echo with parades and protests, speeches and gunfire. Newspapers multiply, schools open, so do prisons. Somewhere in the desert, a telegraph wire hums, carrying orders to crush another uprising. The empire is learning to modernize, but not to heal. Its veins are wired for progress. Its heart still beats in fear. You walk through the old quarter one evening and see a child playing with a paper flag. His mother calls him inside as the curfew bells toll. The sound lingers, sweet and melancholy. You realize the empire's future now belongs to people like him, those too young to remember what was lost and too innocent to know what will be asked of them. The candle that began this story burns shorter still. The wax has almost reached the base. You can smell the end approaching, faint but unmistakable, like rain before a storm. Yet even now, amid all the contradictions and failures, the empire feels alive, wounded, stubborn, magnificent in its refusal to die quietly. You watch the lights of Istanbul flicker against the water and think that perhaps that is the truest legacy of empires, not their conquests, not their reforms, but their endless ability to imagine tomorrow, even when tomorrow is already dissolving into smoke. You open your eyes to the sound of trains, iron wheels grinding on iron tracks, a rhythm that echoes across plains and mountains, carrying messages faster than any horse could gallop. The empire's arteries hum with motion now, telegraph lines singing, locomotives churning smoke into the sky, soldiers moving from one restless province to another. Modernity, once a whisper in foreign tongues, now marches in Ottoman boots. But if you listen closely, beneath the mechanical pulse there is another sound, a low murmur of fatigue, the collective sigh of a nation being stretched between centuries. You find yourself walking through a barracks near Salonika. The air smells of sweat, oil, and damp uniforms. Young officers are gathered around a table, their faces lit by a single lantern. Maps are spread out before them, dotted with pins and smudged with fingerprints. They talk of reforms, of loyalty, of saving the homeland from both its enemies and itself. They are products of the empire's own ambition, trained in modern schools, fluent in European tactics, armed with conviction and impatience. They have read Rousseau and Machiavelli with equal passion, and they believe that history favors the bold. You watch as one of them, sharp-eyed, calm, already commanding respect, leans over the table and says quietly, "If we do not change the empire will change us into its ruin." His name will echo far beyond this room, though no one here yet knows it. The empire's leaders, older and heavier, still argue in the capital about constitutions and loyalty. In distant provinces, famine and corruption erode whatever authority their speeches carry. It is not rebellion that kills empires. It is contradiction. The Ottoman dream of unity clashes with the reality of division. Armenians, Arabs, Greeks, Kurds, Turks, all seeking a voice in a system built on hierarchy. You walk through villages where men still recite the Sultan's name in Friday prayers, unaware that in Istanbul another committee has already begun rewriting his laws. In some towns, people speak of the Constitution as if it were a miracle, in others, as if it were a curse. News travels faster now, and rumor even faster than news. The telegraph wires hum with dispatches that carry both truth and treachery. Every province demands reform but fears what reform might bring. The army, once the empire's spine, begins to twist into factions, those who remain loyal to the Sultan and those who follow the Committee of Union and Progress, the young Turk's political body that now rules in all but name. The Sultan himself watches helplessly as the power he once clutched like prayer beads slips through his fingers. He still rides out occasionally, still receives ambassadors, still prays 5 times a day, but his eyes are those of a man waiting for his own shadow to betray him. You travel to the city of Edirne, where tension hums in the air like static before lightning. Soldiers drill in the courtyards, students whisper in back alleys, posters bloom overnight on walls, some praising reform, others denouncing it as heresy. The empire's cities have become mirrors facing each other, reflecting confusion endlessly. You stand in a cafe where the waiter pours bitter coffee into small porcelain cups. The patrons argue softly about Europe's alliances. Someone mentions the Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia, and the room falls silent. Everyone knows what it means. Europe no longer even pretends to respect Ottoman borders. The humiliation stings deeper than any wound on the battlefield. In the palace, the Sultan's council debates how to respond. Some urge diplomacy, others vengeance, but all agree that the empire's hands are tied by its debts. Even the cannons that defend its shores are financed by foreign loans. The Sultan signs another decree, but it feels ceremonial. Outside, in the gardens, a gardener trims roses that bloom too late in the season. He hums to himself, unaware that his work is the perfect metaphor for his master's reign, beauty maintained by habit, not hope. You move forward through the years as the world darkens. The Balkans ignite in revolt. Serbia, Greece and Bulgaria rise against Ottoman rule, their banners carried by men who once studied under Ottoman teachers. The empire's army marches to suppress them, but finds itself outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. You walk among the wounded in field tents, their faces pale beneath the flicker of lanterns. The stench of blood and iodine fills the air. A doctor with trembling hands mutters that the empire is bleeding from too many wounds at once. He is not wrong. In the streets of Istanbul, news of defeat spreads like contagion. Shops close early, newspapers sell out within minutes. And in the coffee houses, men lower their voices when they speak of the government. Some whisper that God has turned away. Others blame the corruption of ministers or the arrogance of reformers. Everyone blames someone because it is easier than admitting that the world itself has changed. The empire's strength once came from faith and diversity. Now those same qualities feel like weights dragging it toward the abyss. You walk through the harbour at night, where ships creak against the docks. The air is heavy with the smell of fish and coal. A sailor sits on a crate, staring into the dark water. He tells you that he used to believe the empire would last forever. His grandfather fought for it, his father served it, and now he watches it crumble in installments. We keep patching holes, he says, but the ship itself is rotten. His words hang in the air, unchallenged. Far away, in Europe, another storm gathers. Nations are arming, alliances are forming, and the continent trembles with anticipation. When the Great War begins, the Ottoman Empire will join not out of ambition, but out of desperation, to prove it still matters, to reclaim dignity through sacrifice. But tonight, that future is still a shadow on the horizon. Tonight, the empire breathes uneasily under a borrowed moon. You find yourself once again in the palace gardens. The Sultan has grown frail. He sits by a fountain that no longer flows, listening to the faint hum of the city below. He speaks to no one, but you hear the words he might be thinking, that the greatest tragedy of power is not losing it, but realizing you were never truly in control. He closes his eyes, and for a moment, you imagine he can see the ghosts of his ancestors, the conquerors, the poets, the dreamers standing behind him, silent, disappointed, merciful. The candle that has followed you from the beginning burns almost to its end now. Its flame trembles in the wind, but it still clings to life. You take one last look at the city stretching across the strait, and you understand that the fatal mistake was not one of choice, but of faith. The faith that empire could survive on memory alone. The desert waits for you in silence. Gone are the marble courtyards and the damp air of Istanbul. Now the wind itself seems ancient, carrying the scent of dust and heat and things that never forget. You walk beneath a sky so wide it feels cruel. Somewhere beyond the horizon the Great War has begun, and the Ottoman Empire has thrown its fate upon the sand. It is here in these endless dunes that loyalty will fracture and history will turn from politics to prophecy. The army moves like a mirage, long lines of soldiers and camels stretching across the horizon, the glint of bayonets flickering like stars fallen to earth. You can hear the creak of leather, the rasp of breath, the soft clinking of metal against metal. The Empire's banners still flutter proudly, but they are tattered at the edges, their colours dulled by dust. These men have come to fight for God, for country, for a sultan they will never meet. They march because they have been told it will bring glory. But the desert knows better. The desert has buried too many armies to believe in glory. You walk among them, feeling the heat rise from the ground like a punishment. Their uniforms are frayed, their boots splitting, their water skins half empty. Yet they sing, low, defiant songs that roll across the sand in rhythms older than empire itself. They sing not for victory, but for survival. The officers shout commands, their voices hoarse. The rifles they carry gleam faintly under the relentless sun, many stamped with the names of European manufacturers. The irony does not escape you. An empire fighting for its life armed with weapons bought from the very nations that wish it gone. Far behind the lines, tents rise like pale ghosts against the horizon. Inside one of them, a general studies a map that has already begun to betray him. The ink smudges in the heat. The borders drawn by distant diplomats mean nothing out here. He wipes his brow and mutters a prayer. The orders he carries are clear, yet the world around him is dissolving into chaos. Allies promise aid that never arrives. Supplies vanish, and the men under his command grow thinner with each passing day. Still, he insists the empire will endure. It must. To admit otherwise would be to surrender not just land, but identity. As the sun falls, the desert turns the color of rusted gold. You can see the first stars pierce the sky. The soldiers settle around their fires, their faces illuminated by the soft orange glow. They speak of home, of wives, of children, of the scent of rain on stone. One man describes Istanbul as if it were paradise, though he has never seen it. Another laughs quietly and says paradise is wherever water still flows. You sit beside them and listen, and for a moment the empire feels human again, small, fragile, full of yearning. In the distance, gunfire cracks like breaking glass. The British have arrived, their forces marching from the south with better weapons, better logistics, and fewer illusions. Among them are Arabs, former subjects of the empire who now fight under foreign flags, persuaded by promises of independence. You remember the stories whispered in the coffee houses of Damascus, of a man from Mecca who carries letters from London and dreams of a united Arabia. His name travels through the camps like rumor and wildfire, stirring both admiration and resentment. Some call him a traitor, others a liberator. History will call him both. The Desert Campaign unfolds not as a grand war, but as a slow unspooling of exhaustion. You watch men dig trenches in sand that offers no protection, march toward wells already poisoned, fight battles that change nothing but the number of graves. The empire's generals cling to maps that no longer matter. Their telegrams to Istanbul grow shorter, their optimism thinner. The Sultan's call for jihad, meant to unite the faithful, echoes into the void. The faithful are busy surviving. At night, the wind rises, and the sand moves like water. You walk through an abandoned camp, tents half buried, fires long dead. A single kettle hangs from a collapsed pole, rocking gently in the wind. You pick it up and see the faint reflection of your own face, distorted and uncertain. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the Empire's enemies celebrate another victory, another railway taken, another fortress lost. But here, under the indifferent stars, none of it feels like triumph. It feels like erosion. You travel westward with a caravan of wounded men. Their bandages are stained, their lips cracked. They speak little. One of them hums a prayer, another clutches a photograph, a sepia image of a woman holding a child. The Empire may still claim vast territory on the maps, but in this moment it is contained within the trembling hands of a soldier who no longer remembers why he fights. The medic beside him murmurs that the real war is not against Britain or France, but against time itself. The Empire is running out of it. When you finally reach the city of Damascus, the air feels different, denser, charged with betrayal. The streets are crowded with soldiers, refugees, merchants, spies. Everyone has chosen a side, or pretends they have. The minarets rise proudly, but the sound of prayer mingles with the rumble of artillery in the distance. A British officer rides through the market, flanked by Arab fighters waving new banners. The shopkeepers watch in silence. You can almost hear the Empire's heart cracking, not in rage, but in resignation. In a quiet courtyard, you find an old scholar sitting beneath an orange tree. He is writing something on a scrap of paper. When you ask what it is, he smiles faintly and says, "An obituary." "For what?" you ask. He gestures toward the city, the sky, the world, for the idea that faith alone can hold men together. Then he tears the paper into pieces and lets the wind carry them away. As night falls, the muezzins call to prayer across Damascus, their voices overlapping like waves. You stand still, listening. The Empire is not dead yet, but it has entered the part of dying that feels too quiet to notice. The stars above the desert burn steady, ancient, unconcerned. Tomorrow there will be another battle, another treaty, another headline in another language. But tonight there is only the wind, whispering through the dunes, carrying with it the last breath of an empire that once believed itself eternal. The war ends not with a roar, but with a long, uneven exhale. You wake in a railway station that no longer belongs to any one country. The tracks still stretch east and west, but no trains run on time. They carry soldiers, orphans, rumours, never hope. The Ottoman banners have been taken down, their cloth repurposed as blankets and rags. The empire is no longer an empire, yet no one dares to say it aloud. The silence is too raw, too heavy with ghosts. You walk through Istanbul once more, though it feels smaller now, as if grief has shrunk its streets. The mosques still stand, proud and tired. The seagulls still circle the Bosphorus. But the air tastes different, saltier, more uncertain. Flags of foreign nations hang from ships in the harbour. Soldiers in strange uniforms patrol the docks. Their boots strike the stones with a rhythm that does not belong here. You see the locals look away, pretending to be busy, pretending this is temporary. Every empire dies twice, once in battle, once in denial. In the palace, the last sultan sits at his desk surrounded by the detritus of power. His robes are immaculate, his rings still gleam, but his eyes are hollowed by sleeplessness. He has received the news formally. The war is lost, the treaties signed, the territories divided. It comes to him not as thunder, but as paperwork. A telegram, a seal, a line in a foreign tongue that means his world is over. He reads it twice, folds it neatly, and places it beside a cup of untouched tea. He whispers a prayer that sounds more like an apology. Outside, the city hums with occupation. British officers drink coffee in hotels once reserved for pashas. French sailors buy trinkets from street vendors who smile too wide. Children run through alleyways waving whatever scraps of cloth they can find, not yet old enough to understand that colours can be prisons. The air smells of coal smoke and resignation. You walk along the Bosphorus and see men lowering crates onto ships bound for Europe, manuscripts, carpets, heirlooms, all labeled reparations. A fisherman nearby spits into the water and mutters that the sea has seen worse. In a small mosque near Ayub, an old imam leads a handful of worshippers in prayer. His voice cracks, but the rhythm never falters. You stand in the doorway, feeling the weight of centuries press against your ribs. For all its wars, its debts, its cruelty, the empire had also been a bridge, a place where dozens of tongues could still share one sky. Now the bridge is burning, and everyone is busy claiming their own piece of the ashes. One evening, word spreads through the city. The Sultan has fled. He leaves under the cover of night, carried by a British warship that cuts silently through the black water. The palace servants watch from the shore as its lanterns fade into distance. Some weep, others simply stare. A boy in the crowd asks his mother where the Sultan is going. She says, "To a quieter place." It is the kindest lie anyone can offer. You follow the ship in your mind, tracing its slow passage toward exile. The Sultan sits alone on deck, wrapped in a heavy coat, staring at the wake unfurling behind him. The cold air bites at his skin, but he barely feels it. He is writing letters, hundreds of them, to ministers who will never answer, to subjects who no longer exist. Each begins the same way. To those who remember, it is an act of desperation and devotion. A man trying to keep his empire alive on paper when the world has already turned the page. Weeks later, he arrives in Europe. The newspapers call him the Caliph in exile. He stays in a modest villa surrounded by chestnut trees, a far cry from the tiled domes of Topkapi. The neighbors whisper about the foreign man who walks the garden at dawn, muttering prayers into the cold air. They say he pays for everything in gold coins, that he writes until his hands shake. None of them know that he carries with him a small wooden box filled with dirt from the courtyard of his old palace. Each morning he opens it and presses his fingers into the soil, as if to remind himself he once belonged to something larger than loss. Meanwhile, back in Istanbul, the city remakes itself with a kind of manic determination. Flags are replaced, street names changed, uniforms redesigned. A new government rises from the ruins, promising a rebirth free of the empire's burdens. Factories hum again, schools open, the language itself begins to change. Words replaced, alphabets rewritten. The air crackles with ambition and anxiety in equal measure. The young speak of progress. The old speak of betrayal. You stand in a square where once imperial parades marched. Now it is filled with construction scaffolding and slogans. The empire has become a nation, but nations, like children, learn to walk by forgetting how they crawled. In exile, the Sultan grows quieter. He receives fewer visitors, writes fewer letters. The newspapers have moved on to newer revolutions. Some mornings he walks down to the edge of a lake and tosses crumbs to the ducks. The sound of their wings startles him. It reminds him of the call to prayer. He closes his eyes and imagines it echoing through the courtyards of a city that no longer calls his name. The neighbors think he is simply a melancholic old man. They are not wrong. One afternoon, a storm rolls in. The wind rattles the shutters. The rain beats against the glass. The Sultan sits by the window and watches the trees bend. He thinks of his ancestors, the conquerors, the dreamers, the men who built an empire from the dust of others. He wonders if they would forgive him, or if they would understand that sometimes history does not fall by failure but by fatigue. He whispers a verse from the Koran under his breath, a prayer for mercy, then leans back in his chair and closes his eyes. The storm passes. The rain stops. When the servants enter hours later, they find him still sitting, a faint smile on his lips, as if he has finally found his quieter place. You walk again through Istanbul, now reborn as something new. The air feels lighter, though it carries a faint echo of the past in every breeze. Children play in the courtyards, their laughter mingling with the cries of seagulls. Somewhere in the distance, a muezzin calls the faithful to prayer, his voice rising above the traffic and construction. The candle that began this story is now only a stub, but its last glow reflects off the Bosphorus like a promise. The empire is gone, but its shadow stretches long and gentle, not as a warning, but as a reminder that even endings can be beautiful when faced with grace. The candlelight of empire has gone out, but the table of victors still gleams beneath crystal chandeliers. You find yourself far from Istanbul now, in a Parisian hall that smells of wine, perfume, and politics. The year is 1919, and the world is trying to convince itself that it has survived the war. The victors gather here to redraw maps, to rewrite reality with fountain pens that leak ink and ambition in equal measure. You watch as men in tailored coats and polished shoes lean over parchment, slicing borders like surgeons who mistake precision for mercy. The Ottoman delegation sits at one end of the room, silent, smaller, outnumbered. Their faces carry the fatigue of centuries. Before them lie stacks of papers, treaties, demands, reparations, clauses written in languages that twist even the sharpest minds into confusion. The representatives of Britain, France, and Italy discuss what to do with the empire's remains. To them, it is not a land of millions but a problem of logistics. Oil, trade routes, influence, all of it must be distributed neatly. They speak of mandates, protectorates, spheres of influence. None of these words mean freedom. They are just elegant synonyms for ownership. You stand near the doorway, invisible, listening as the clerk reads aloud the new borders of the Middle East. You can hear the scratch of his pen as he makes small corrections to enormous consequences. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, names that sound like poetry now carved into bureaucratic geometry. No one in this room has ever seen the deserts they divide, or smelled the orange blossoms of Damascus, or walked through the markets of Baghdad at dusk. The men at this table will never hear the voices of those who will live under these lines. You realize that empire is not truly destroyed when it falls, it simply changes architects. Outside, Paris hums with relief and revelry. Soldiers home from the front fill the cafes, musicians play, and lovers stroll along the Seine, as if the century itself has been reborn. But inside this hall, the past is being dissected. A French general jokes that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. The laughter that follows is polished and cruel. Across the table, one Ottoman delegate lowers his eyes and folds his hands tightly. He knows there will be no resurrection in these papers, only memorials disguised as settlements. The treaties are signed one after another, each seal pressed into wax like the thud of a coffin lid. You feel the weight of history harden in the air. By the time the final document is complete, the Ottoman Empire exists only as memory and metaphor. The diplomats shake hands, their smiles thin. The map is rolled up, the candles extinguished, and the world moves on. You stand in the empty hall after they've left, staring at the faint indentations left by compasses and rulers. Somewhere, a janitor sweeps up fallen papers. You pick one up. It's a draft of a clause about Mesopotamia. You read the words and realize they are not the language of peace, but of prelude. The borders drawn here will not hold. They will burn, bleed, and shift again, as all careless lines eventually do. You walk out into the Paris night. The air smells of rain and gasoline. The city glows, unaware that beneath its glittering lights, new fault lines have been drawn across the world. You pass a bookstore displaying translated copies of travel diaries from the East, romantic tales of harems and deserts, written by men who never left Europe. You wonder whether anyone will ever tell the story as it truly was, not the decadence of decline, but the quiet dignity of endurance. Years later, you find yourself in a small apartment overlooking the Bosphorus once more. Istanbul is no longer the capital of empire, but it still feels like the capital of memory. The new government has built its seat inland, away from the old ghosts, but the sea refuses to forget. Ships still pass through, carrying grain, oil, pilgrims, dreams. You can almost hear them whisper in a dozen languages, each syllable a fragment of what was lost and what survived. In the cafes, the conversations have changed. Students now speak of science and progress. Merchants talk of trade with Europe, not tribute to it. Yet beneath the optimism runs an undercurrent of nostalgia. though no one dares name it. The city's soul remains half in prayer, half in poetry. You walk along the Galata Bridge and see old men fishing, their lines trailing into waters that once carried fleets of conquest. One of them hums an old Ottoman song, off-key but unbroken. When you ask him if he misses the empire, he chuckles and says, "You cannot miss the sea when you still live by the shore." Far away, the exiled princes and princesses scatter across Europe. Some become musicians, teachers, restaurateurs, others fade into obscurity. A few marry into foreign families, their stories diluted like ink in water. You imagine them opening trunks filled with relics of a vanished world, photographs, prayer beads, medals, letters stamped with crests that no longer exist. They are ghosts who still breathe. You meet one such exile in a cafe in Vienna, years after the treaties. He wears a simple suit, his accent soft and untraceable. He stirs his tea absently and says, "We thought the world would remember us for what we built. Instead, they remember us for how we fell." You look into his eyes and realize that history does not remember fairly. It remembers conveniently. Back in Paris, the maps drawn at that glittering table have already begun to unravel. Revolts flare in the deserts, borders bend under pressure, promises break like glass. The architects of peace are long gone, replaced by new generations of politicians who still speak the same language of control. You think of the Sultan's reflection in his mirror, of the soldiers in the desert, of the scholar who wrote an obituary for faith. The empire's body may be gone, but its spirit lingers everywhere, sometimes in architecture, sometimes in cuisine, sometimes in the ache of belonging that outlives geography. As night falls over Istanbul, you sit by the water and watch the ferries cross from Europe to Asia and back again. Lights shimmer on the waves, reflecting a city forever caught between worlds. The people here have learned to live with that duality, to pray in one direction and dream in another. You realize that perhaps the empire's greatest gift was not its rule, but its rhythm, a reminder that the world's beauty often lies in its contradictions. The candle on your table has almost burned down. The wax drips slowly, forming a shape that looks a little like a map. You smile at the thought. History, after all, is nothing but melted time trying to find new form. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of the sea, and somewhere in the distance a church bell and a call to prayer ring together for a fleeting second before fading into the night. The city wakes slowly, like a dream reluctant to release you. Morning light drips over the domes and rooftops of Istanbul, painting them in silver and ash. You hear the gulls before you see them, their cries slicing through the stillness. Steam rises from the tea shops. The ferries groan against their ropes. The empire is gone, but the rhythm remains, the same pulse that once carried armies and poets and prayers across continents. You walk through the streets as the vendors set up their stalls, selling figs, bread, and stories older than their grandfathers. The smell of sesame and charcoal fills the air. A man sings an old Ottoman ballad under his breath as he stacks his loaves, unaware that his song is a relic and a blessing all at once. The world around you is modern now. Automobiles, radios, electric lamps. But the ghosts still linger. They sit in the corners of coffee houses, invisible but audible, whispering in a dozen forgotten dialects. You pass a group of schoolchildren reciting a poem in the new language of the Republic. Their teacher claps along, proud, but you notice the hesitation in the older shopkeepers listening nearby. For them, the alphabet itself has become a kind of exile. Words that once carried prayers now feel foreign in their mouths. Change is progress, yes, but it is also erasure. You cross the Galata Bridge again. Just as the first sunlight hits the water, fishermen cast their lines, their silhouettes sharp against the shimmer. On the far shore, the skyline of mosques and minarets stands serene, unbothered by politics. You realize that while power passes from hand to hand, beauty endures out of sheer stubbornness. The empire may have fallen, but the city refuses to stop breathing. It has learned to survive everything: fires, invasions, earthquakes, reformations, even memory. As you wander through the Grand Bazaar, the sound of commerce envelops you. Coins clink, fabrics rustle, voices bargain in 10 languages. Somewhere, a merchant tells a tourist that this carpet design dates back to the days of the sultans. He says it with pride, though he does not mention that his great-grandfather once sold to courtiers, not collectors. You touch the woven threads and feel the texture of centuries, each knot a prayer, each pattern a map of faith and survival. The fatal mistake of empire, you think, was not arrogance or cruelty, but forgetting that no kingdom lasts forever. Yet the hands that weave, trade, and feed do last. They endure quietly while thrones crumble loudly. You step outside into the sunlight and follow the hill upward to Topkapi Palace. The gates are open now, a museum instead of a throne. Tourists shuffle through with cameras whispering in reverence. You walk behind them, tracing the same corridors you once crossed by candlelight. The walls still glow faintly with that same pale blue tile, the same patterns repeating endlessly, as if trying to remind time of symmetry. In the chambers, the old thrones gleam under glass, stripped of power but not of majesty. You stop before the Sultan's mirror, the same one that once reflected centuries of rulers and later their exhaustion. Your reflection joins theirs, layered upon layer, like a palimpsest of ambition and regret. For a moment you think you can almost see him again, the Sultan who stared into this glass and saw the empire fading behind his eyes. The candle beside him, the ink drying on treaties, the hesitation that echoed louder than any battle cry. His mistake was believing that faith and finance could coexist without cost. Yet looking into that same mirror now, you realize no empire collapses simply because of one man's error. It collapses because history itself demands change. The candle must go out for dawn to arrive. You walk into the courtyard and breathe in the air. The cypress trees still stand tall, their shadows long and solemn. You hear footsteps on the stone behind you. A guide leading a group of visitors, explaining in practiced tones how this palace once ruled half the world. You turn and smile faintly, because you know that what he says is both true and incomplete. The empire's reach was vast, yes, but its heart was always fragile. It ruled through stories as much as through swords, and when the stories changed, so did the world. You leave the palace and wander down toward the shore where the Bosphorus glitters like liquid memory. The water moves endlessly between continents, refusing to choose one over the other. Ferries cross back and forth, carrying people who do not think of history as they sip their tea and check their watches. But you do. You stand at the edge of the pier and feel the wind against your face, cold and alive. You think of the soldiers in the desert, the students with their pamphlets, the scholars writing obituaries for belief, the exiled sultan clutching soil from his homeland. All of them still here, somewhere in the salt air, still whispering. The sun climbs higher, and the water turns from silver to blue. You know that every empire leaves behind two things, ruins and rhythms. The ruins become lessons, the rhythms become habits. You listen to the hum of the ferries, the call of the muezzin, the chatter of the markets, and realize that these are the empire's true survivors. Not monuments or armies, but sound, soft, persistent, human. Later, as evening falls, you return to a small cafe overlooking the sea. The waiter brings you tea in a tulip-shaped glass. You sit quietly, watching the city lights flicker on one by one, reflecting in the dark water like stars returning home. Somewhere, a radio plays an old Ottoman love song, its melody stretched, its words half forgotten. You close your eyes and listen. The music feels like forgiveness. You take a deep breath, letting the night air fill your lungs. The fatal mistake that ended the empire was never one act, one war, or one treaty. It was a slow forgetting, a belief that greatness could survive without gratitude, that identity could be borrowed, that faith could be negotiated. But in that forgetting came something strangely tender, rebirth. Out of the ashes, a new language, a new nation, a new way of belonging was born. Empires die, people do not. They adapt, sing, rebuild, and remember in quieter ways. You finish your tea and stand. The candle on your table flickers once, then steadies. Across the water, the city glows like an ember refusing to die. You smile because you know that nothing truly ends. It only changes shape. The Bosphorus breathes. The call to prayer rises, and somewhere far away, a clock in an old palace still ticks, still measuring a time that no longer exists but refuses to be forgotten. The night settles like dust over everything. The ferries have stopped, the markets have closed, and even the gulls seem too tired to cry. The city sighs in its sleep, that deep, slow rhythm of tides and breath that has never truly changed. You walk one last time along the shore, where the water laps gently at the stones, whispering in a language older than empires. The lanterns in the distance shimmer, each one a tiny echo of the stars above, each one proof that darkness never fully wins. Your footsteps slow. The air cools. Somewhere in the hills a dog barks once and is answered by silence. The smell of the sea carries the faint sweetness of rain, and you realize the storm has passed, not just the one in the sky, but the long, weary storm of history itself. What remains is softer. The edges have blurred. The grief that once felt sharp now hums like a lullaby. You close your eyes and imagine the candle that has followed you through these stories, its flame trembling, patient, alive. It has seen palaces, deserts, treaties, exiles, and yet it still burns. That is all any civilization ever truly does. It burns until it becomes memory, and then memory becomes light. You sit at the edge of the water and breathe slowly. The world has quieted to a heartbeat. The wind tastes of salt and sleep. In the distance, a single minaret gleams, its reflection stretching across the black glass of the Bosphorus. For a moment it looks like a candle floating on the surface of time. You let your thoughts drift with it, unhurried, unbound, until even they fade into stillness. And then, gently, completely, like a candle going out,